You are listening to a Difference for One podcast, episode number 18.
I'm Michelle.
I'm Nicole.
I'm Charisse.
And I'm Cami.
We are the English sisters.
We come together to share life-changing methods of improvement through a variety of topics.
We hope that above all, these discussions will help you feel that Jesus Christ is making a difference for you, the one.
And we also hope that our podcast will inspire you to find simple ways that you can make a difference for one.
Hi guys, I am ecstatic to talk about the topic today of teaching children about healthy sexuality. It's just Cami today, and it may be a little surprising that it's me who cares so much to talk about it, being the youngest with the least amount of quote-unquote experience. But it is something that I have found that I'm really passionate about, and I just want to say before you start thinking that I'm not qualified to talk about this topic because I'm newly married and I don't have any children of my own, you are right. But I do think that everyone could probably learn a thing or two. And let me just say that we are all eternal and divine beings who are innately sexual. So everyone has experience and understands things more than we probably give people credit for. Plus, when it comes to this particular topic, I was a child not that long ago. So just to give you a little background on why I feel so passionately about the subject of healthy sexuality, I took a class at BYU with my husband Tanner called Healthy Sexuality in Marriage, and I took it from Dr. Shalom Levitt, and it was a semester right before Tanner and I got engaged and married. And at first, I was nervous about, what kind of things might be talked about, but it turned out to be the most beautiful and life-transforming experience for me. Taking that class really made me view myself differently, and I viewed others around me differently, and really and truly, I started to look at the world in a new light. And I know that sounds maybe a little dramatic, but it just really changed my perspective on a lot of things. The concepts that were taught in that class, I feel, apply to every single individual on the planet, and they also apply to areas of our lives that have seemingly nothing to do with sexuality. So while taking that class, I quickly learned that this is something I want to spend my entire life learning about and studying and teaching. So while I am only barely a novice, and a lot of the concepts that I'll talk about have come from that class, since that class, I have taken every opportunity in college when we get to choose a topic for a paper to somehow tie it back into sexuality. So I have done quite a bit of research on my own, not to mention, the hours of TED Talks I've listened to and books I've read and people I've talked to and pondering that I've done on the subject. I do not claim to be an expert by any means, but I believe that the things I have to share are very valuable. So hopefully this will be the first of many episodes on this subject, but as I talk about ideas and concepts, I'll try to include the research or source where I got the information as much as possible, because having valid sources is something that's important to me when I hear information from others. And again, a lot of the information came from the class I took from Shalom Levitt, who has many studies of her own. So just to give a little bit of her credibility, she studied economics at BYU and attended law school there, as well as getting a master's in marriage, family, and human development. She also taught law in Eastern Europe and later returned to Ukraine as a Fulbright Fellow to research and teach on family relationships. She then attended Penn State, where she earned her PhD in human development and family studies. Her professional affiliations are Society for Prevention Research, National Council on Family Relations, and Utah State Bar. She researches issues surrounding healthy sex within committed relationships. She also examines how being mindful in daily experiences and sexual experiences may be associated with increased sexual satisfaction. Needless to say, she has been studying this for quite some time. So while I didn't write down most sources that she cited in the class, and I won't be able to reference all of those here, she is someone that I trust as a valid source. I'll hopefully be doing research with her in a couple months, and it is my dream to have her on the podcast. But for now, I will link her information and website in the show notes, where she has recently started a podcast of her own. And as much as I'm happy to plug her all day long because she is the one who got me interested in this subject, I do think that I will have unique insights and perspectives to add to this conversation, and I hope that you'll stick around for that. I also just want to make a couple quick notes here. The first being that a lot of times I will be assuming heterosexual relationships and talking about men and women, as that is where a lot of the research lies. And I do think that a lot of these concepts would apply to anyone, regardless of how they identify. The second note is that I have a lot of strong opinions about gender stereotyping and generalizations. I think that they can be harmful when they perpetuate beliefs that aren't always shared by the people in that population. So I'll try my best to say things like higher desire person and lower desire person rather than men and women, but sometimes I may just say men or women for convenience sake. So please just take what's helpful for you and, let go of the things that don't apply. I'll also usually be referring to sexuality within marriage when it comes to talking about couples. The third note is that I'm going to guess that a lot of people think they have a lot of things figured out. So I would just invite each of you to try listening with an open mind, thinking about how these concepts might apply to you or how you could implement them in your own lives, even if you feel like you already understand a lot of these things in theory. Together, I hope that we can all have a little more humility and create an open space for new thoughts and feelings. Along with that, I think we do a lot of assuming about what people understand on this subject, so I'm just going to assume no one understands anything and go from there.
We'll be back after this quick break with a message from our sponsors.
So without further ado, let's just get into it. I want to start by talking about some basic things because I think it's important to have a secure foundation. So I find it interesting that the word that splits the human race in half, meaning when it comes to biological assignment at birth, now means the act of bringing the two halves together. And I just think that that's a beautiful metaphor. Also, the fact that, back in the day, a person wasn't legally married until intercourse had occurred. So to me, that just shows how it creates the highest bond. Sex is a Latin prefix meaning 6, and the number 6 is the smallest perfect number because the divisors of 6 are 1, 2, and 3, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. So if you break that down, 1 is an individual, 2 is a couple, and 3 is the Godhead. And I love this visual for many reasons. As an individual, God created me to have a body and emotions and mentality, and one of the most important aspects that is not given nearly enough reverence, sexuality. And as an individual, it's crucial for me to understand my own sexuality, to be with it and hold space for it and show gratitude towards it as the gift that it is. And the idea of being sexual starts as an individual, regardless of any relationship in my life. But how much greater that can be when it is an experience shared between a committed couple. Having to understand sexuality as it pertains to you and your partner as a unit can be extremely edifying. Having two equal and in some respects opposite beings brought into one union creates depth perception. And what really refines that process is including the Godhead. So those components of understanding yourself, coming together as a couple, and including God in the relationship are what can ultimately create a quote-unquote perfect experience. Sexual wholeness consists of 3 dimensions: spiritual, physical, and emotional. And I hope to hit this concept home a lot throughout episodes because it's so crucial to understand. The physical side of sex obviously gets the most attention, but the emotional side seems to be more important than the physical in the research. Emotional strength has the greatest potential within committed relationships, even if the couple is not married, which I think is important to understand. And there's a lot more that goes into those 3 dimensions that I won't go into right now, but having a well-rounded idea of what sexuality should be in your own life, I believe will help in the process of trying to teach those same principles to your children. I think that the problem really starts because parents often think that they should wait until their child is a certain age before they start discussing these things with them. Whether it's waiting until puberty or waiting until they start asking questions or whatever it might be, it seems to be a common idea that you sit down with your child for a one-time conversation, explain intercourse, ask them if they have any questions, and then move on with your life, hoping that they'll come to you if they ever do have a question. My news for you is that as much as you might like to think they're coming to you, they are likely reaching out to other sources to find understanding in a way that doesn't make them feel awkward. So one of the most important things you can do is to start young. And by young, I mean like when your child comes out of the womb young. Practice saying body parts out loud to your infant so you can start getting used to not only saying things out loud, but saying them to your child. Then as your child gets a little bit older, where they're starting to understand you and you teach them the different body parts, don't exclude sexual body parts. Teach them the vocabulary just like you would any other body part. When you start getting more specific, like moving from where's your foot to where is your toenail, don't be afraid to get more specific with other things, like moving from where is your chest to where is your nipple. If you talk about them like they're normal parts of the body, rather than glossing over them out of fear and not necessarily focusing on them more than other things, it creates a natural dialogue. Then when they start getting older, like ages 3 to 7, you can talk about things very simply and answer questions very simply. For example, when they're in the bathtub, as you're cleaning them, you can tell them what's happening. We're washing behind your ears. Now we're cleaning your belly. Now we're cleaning your penis. Now we're cleaning your legs. Now we're cleaning your feet. It's okay to make them common words. And I know a lot of people avoid saying those words because of the way sex and these body parts are portrayed in society and media. But it is your responsibility to make the change in your own home. And that starts with conversations, not secrecy. So a common question is, what do I do if my child is touching themselves? And when they're little, distraction is a great tool. That doesn't mean that you avoid the subject like the plague, but if you put a lot of emphasis and draw more attention by saying things like, don't do that, that's bad, or don't touch that, with no explanation, it creates confusion in their minds. Instead, you can say something like, hey, why don't we play with this toy together? Give them something they can do rather than telling them something they can't. Which, by the way, I've heard is a great parenting tactic in a lot of different areas. So as they're getting older and they start moving towards puberty around ages like 9 through 12, you can start talking about how boys and girls are different in some ways and the same in other ways. At that age, they will likely have a renewed interest as they're experiencing new changes in their own bodies. In my class with Dr. Levitt, she had us draw naked bodies on the first day, and I felt mortified. We were supposed to draw a young version of a boy and girl and an adult version of a boy and girl, just as an exercise to notice differences. The most that I could do was draw blob bodies with 2 dots on the chest, and that was for the male and female young and old versions. My brain was totally not trained to think of it as anatomy or God's creation or anything along those lines. It just felt wrong. And I remember even covering my paper with my hand because I felt embarrassed even though I knew everyone in the class was doing the same exercise and maybe feeling the same thing as me. So maybe it's not a bad idea to have something like a family lesson where everyone practices drawing naked bodies. I think that could help them understand that 1, bodies don't always have to be sexualized negatively, and 2, their own body will go through changes and it's completely normal. Now, once your children get to be teenagers, it's a great idea to have weekly conversations. And I know that may sound outrageous to some of you. It definitely did to me when I heard that, but it is so important to make it a common topic in your home. The truth is that you should never need an icebreaker because there would never be any ice to be broken since you've been talking about these things their whole lives. So talk about it as often as you talk about friends or school, church, hobbies, or anything else that's normal. And the reason that it's so important to talk early and often is because, like it or not, exposure will come. And when it does, you want to be sure that you were their first exposure. The truth is that a lot of times, by the time a parent is ready to sit down with their child to have the talk, that child has already seen pornography, heard obscenities at school on the daily, and at least had some close friends who have done more than you'd like to know. So being their first and constant exposure makes it much more likely that you will be the person they turn to for answers rather than the internet or their friends. You have to make sure that you are a safe place for them to come. Something I want to mention that happens often is that parents will feel uncomfortable about it themselves, but they want their children to know that they're open. So they overcompensate by doing things like yelling out erogenous body parts or maybe flippantly talking about sex. And that is not the answer either. I think this is something to really take seriously and treat with reverence and not just use as a punchline and think that it's fine because you're married. It isn't uncommon for children to feel awkward talking about this subject no matter what, because they do have some exposure to the world, but making them want to curl up in a ball even more because it's treated with little regard doesn't help anyone's case. So I think it's really important to present yourself in a way where you don't feel uncomfortable about the subject yourself and you're ready and open to have hard conversations. So you don't just come up to them and say, hey, do you have any questions about anything? Let me know, So I think it's really crucial to prepare ourselves for these things beforehand. Now, let's talk metaphors. I'm going to give a couple metaphors and I want you to think about which way is better for explaining to your kids. And this comes straight from the book, A Better Way to Teach Kids About Sex. So the first metaphor is where a teacher showed a class a delicious wrapped cupcake and asked if any of them would like to eat it. After many students enthusiastically said they wanted the treat, the teacher unwrapped the cupcake and had them pass it around. After each person had handled it, the teacher asked, "Who would like to eat the cupcake now?" This metaphor is similar to another metaphor where a teacher was comparing personal purity to a beautiful china plate. As she showed the girls the plate, she encouraged them to admire its beauty and fine craftsmanship. She extolled its uniqueness and noted that it was worth a very high price. Then, without warning, the leader turned and threw the plate against the wall, shattering it into pieces. The girls were then told that to be sexually impure before marriage was similar to throwing their purity plate against a wall, thus shattering something of great worth. So those were the first set of metaphors, and this is the second metaphor. A teacher gave each young man 2 chocolate candies and told them, "If you bring these chocolates back next week, I'll give you 10 chocolates." So the following week, the boys who brought both their candies back were rewarded with the promised 10 chocolates. Then the advisor said, "Now, for those who bring all 10 chocolates back next week, I'll give you a whole bag of chocolates." You can see where the advisor was going with this, right? At the end of the 3rd week, the advisor used the example to teach the boys that delayed gratification brings bigger rewards and greater satisfactions compared to immediate gratification, and encouraged them to wait for the bigger treat that awaits them in marriage. Now, after listening to those metaphors, which one do you think was better? Was the fear-based metaphor better or the abstinence-based metaphor better? The answer is no metaphor. Because the thing is, sex is the metaphor. I love the part in this book where it says, "Unfortunately, abstinence-based object lessons tend to assume that all expressions of sexuality are similar in intent and purpose, and there is typically no acknowledgement that both loving and lustful approaches to sexuality may occur even in marriage. They incorrectly assume that all sexual expressions after marriage are inherently loving in nature, simply because they take place after a wedding. Simply put, the whys of sex in marriage matter more than the whats of sex. Chastity isn't just about when sex happens, it's about why it happens. We hope that in marriage, sex will be shared for the right reasons, but that requires a deeper and fuller understanding of healthy sexuality." The other problem with abstinence-based metaphors is that it focuses on viewing chastity as a physical issue. And as I mentioned before, sexual wholeness involves physical, emotional, and spiritual. We are putting marriage as a finish line to understanding these principles, when really this is something that we all have to try to master our entire lives, regardless of if we're married or not, or if it's even in the right context. And the problem with the fear-based metaphors, the ones about the cupcake and the shattered plate, is that we really need to be driving home the point that sex is a beautiful, sacred thing. And I love in this book where it says, while sexual sin clearly has negative effects on our lives, fear-based object lessons typically don't include a balanced discussion about the positive consequences associated with healthy sexuality. Even when a balanced view of sexuality is presented, many young people have told us that the negative feelings created from such object lessons are so overwhelming that they struggle to internalize any other messages from the lesson. So the goal is to be able to have open and honest conversations without having to compare sex to anything else. Last thing I'll read from this book, it says, instead of asking what parts of life may be compared to sex, we should ask, how does sex help us better understand other parts of life, especially our discipleship and faithful progression as individuals, couples, and parents? Now, when talking about this, I used the word sacred to describe sex. And I think often people confuse the word sacred with secret. A lot of times, if we consider something sacred, we may think that that means it shouldn't be talked about, or maybe we're afraid to talk about it because we don't want to talk about it in the wrong way. But what I have to say to that is Jesus Christ is sacred, yet I want to talk about him every day of my life. And just because he's sacred doesn't mean that I keep him a secret. In fact, the complete opposite. So when I compare that to sex, I think a lot of times children will get the wrong idea if we don't present it correctly, because they'll think that it being sacred means that it has to be quiet, or I think there's a certain vision of what it might look like because of the way that we describe sacred things, where we're reverent and quiet and peaceful. Sex isn't supposed to be a sacrament meeting or communion, even though it is sacred. So we need to be careful about using the word sacred so much that it's ambiguous, and people think that it has to be a similar experience to being at church or being in a temple. Something along these same lines is using euphemisms. Euphemisms are highly discouraged because even though you might think it's having a positive effect because you are not being so aggressive in your language, it's actually more disrespectful rather than just using the words that are given for these things. And even if you have a teenager who might use slang, it's important for you as the adult source to use the correct terminology anyway. And this goes for anatomical body parts, but it also goes for even just the word sex in and of itself. Like a lot of times we use the word intimacy as a euphemism for sex, when intimacy is not synonymous with sex. You can be intimate in many different settings where it doesn't include actual penile vaginal intercourse. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to go into details with your children about what exactly is going on. But if you're always using phrases like making love or having relations, or, really, there are probably thousands of euphemisms for having sex. So when we're talking to children about these topics, let's not be ambiguous all the time. Let's speak truth, be honest, and have real conversations about it. Parents truly are integral through this learning process, and really it starts in your own life. You teach your children about sexuality without even realizing it based on the way that you interact with your spouse, or even the way that you treat your own body. When you look in the mirror, do you find yourself wishing some parts were a little different? Whether or not you voice those things, it shows in the way you present yourself, and as much as you try to tell your children how beautiful and incredible their bodies are, your attitude about yourself will reflect in the way they see themselves. And those feelings will run deeper than just surface self-image. Studies show that when a person has a negative self-body image, it often decreases the amount of pleasure they're able to feel during sex because they're so consumed with being worried about the way they look. So teach your children to wonder about their bodies. Have you thought about the way you react to normal functions of the body that are considered gross? Like when your child poops, for example, in their diaper, do you make a big fuss about how they stink or that they're dirty? Because instead, it could be something like, oh, let's keep you clean. There are really so many opportunities to be amazed at the body. For example, if they fall and scrape their knee, you could talk to them about how amazing it is that our bodies heal themselves. That is incredible. Or if you are running and playing outside together, you could stop with them and ask them what their body feels like. Can they feel their heart thumping in their chest? Do their legs feel tingly? Do their lungs feel like they need more air? Does their throat feel dry? There are lots of opportunities to help your children be mindful of what is happening in their bodies during any activity, and this will train their brain to listen to their own body and be much more in tune. You can also help them learn to be in awe of the body's ability to reproduce or become bonded to a partner. You can teach them that mom and dad show affection, and that's a beautiful thing. Now, I mentioned not making a fuss when it comes to saying bodily functions are gross. The same can be true of things pertaining to sexuality. For example, let's say your teenager comes home from school and tells you about all of the sexual things people talked about that they were doing. A lot of parents might respond to that by saying something like, "Oh, that is just disgusting. I don't want you hanging around kids like that. They are not a good influence," and making that the end of the discussion. If you feel like it is gross or you are uncomfortable yourself, you're going to pass that on to them. What do you think that child will take away from that conversation? Okay, so these sexual things are gross and anyone who does them is not a good person. Got it. Even if you tag on the end, save that for marriage, the damage has been done. So maybe instead we could be curious with them and ask questions with them, even if that means admitting that you don't have all of the answers. For example, they come home and tell you about all the sexual things that their friends talked about doing, and you respond with, "And what do you think about that?" Or "How does that make you feel?" Their curiosity may be piqued at that time, and the goal is not to crush the curiosity, avoid it, and hope for the best. Let them know that it's okay to wonder about these things. Let's talk about this. And because you know that you plan to have many conversations about these topics, it's okay to not say everything at once. It's okay to take a step back and say that you're each going to think about these things and then come back for a conversation later about it. You don't have to have the conversation every time saying these things are okay, but only in marriage. You can have one conversation where you only talk about the way these things made them feel and that it's normal to feel arousal in the body because that's what those things are made for. And then maybe having a completely separate conversation about how sanctified that experience is when it's in the bounds of marriage. It's okay to challenge the thoughts that you have about sexuality and invite your children to challenge their own thoughts. Learn to substitute your thoughts and help them do the same so that together you can have an understanding that it's natural, healthy, and beautiful. You can help them accept that sexuality is a part of who they are. If you work beside them and give them more credit rather than saying things like "boys will be boys" when having a conversation with a friend because you both assume all teenagers have no control and will do what they want anyway, the truth is that children can learn appreciation and control with time and effort. And having good sexual education early about bodies and feelings and touch will provide permission to talk about their earliest stirrings of sexual feelings. So encourage them to share those things, not suppress them. Along those same lines, if your child does come to you and confides in you about mistakes that they've made, and this really applies to anything, but I'm referring to any sexual act they might be feeling guilty about, it is vital to make the first response love. Tell them, "I am so glad you trust me enough to tell me. Thank you for trusting me with this. I love you." And make that a sacred moment with them. Hold them and listen to them. That first response is critical because through you, they are learning how to trust God. So in that moment, you are not focusing on any hurt or sadness that you might feel. You're not even focusing on the sin, just the fact that they trusted you. Then later, and it doesn't even have to be in the same conversation, you can start to talk to them about other things. You can say, "All right, let's go through some things together that you probably already know, but remember that I am on your side." Don't forget that intimacy and sexuality are designed to bring people closer together, so make sure that the conversations between you as the parent and your child about that subject are aimed to achieve that end. All right, there really are so many more things that I would love to talk about today, but I think that that's probably a good place to wrap it up for now. I am really excited to get your guys' feedback about this conversation and to continue learning and talking about it myself. So until next time, talk to you soon.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. If it resonates with you, the greatest compliment you could give is to share it with a friend who might benefit from it as well. Check out A Difference for One on Instagram for additional content. And if you have any questions, comments, a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you'd be interested in a free mini coaching session, send an email to adifferenceforone@gmail.com.